Driver left me at the end of a narrow road lined with stone walls and cypress trees, the kind of place that looks calm in photos because no one shows the parts where you have to solve problems alone. My suitcase wheels clicked over the uneven gravel as I followed the sound of voices toward the villa. I could already hear glassware clinking somewhere inside, the low hum of people gathering, early the soft music that made everything feel organized and certain. At the front gate, there was a keypad and a small camera pointed down at the entrance. I checked my phone for the code. The last message in the family group chat was a picture of my sister Lena with a caption about wedding week energy and a string of heart emojis. No code, no instructions, no note that said where I was supposed to go when I got there. I pressed the call button beside the gate anyway because that was what you do when you arrive somewhere you're expected. A voice crackled through the speaker in Italian. I answered in English, gave my name, and said I was here for the wedding. There was a pause. Then the voice switched to careful, practiced English. He asked me to spell my last name. I spelled it slowly, the way you do when you're trying not to sound anxious. He told me to wait. I stood there with my suitcase and my carry-on, feeling the afternoon heat on the back of my neck. The road was quiet. No foot traffic. No nearby shops. Just the gate, the camera, and a view of the villa up the hill that I couldn't reach without someone letting me in. A man in a white linen shirt came down the stone path from inside the property. He looked like someone who had been hired to stay calm. He opened the gate part way and stepped out, blocking the space with his body in a polite way that still said, "Not yet." He introduced himself as Matteo, the property manager. He asked for my passport. That was the first time it landed as more than an awkward arrival. Not "come on in," not "we've been waiting," but documentation. I handed it over. He looked at the name, then at his phone. He scrolled with his thumb, face neutral, the way people look when they're reading a list that doesn't match what they were told to expect. He asked again very gently if I was sure I was staying on the property. I told him I was the bride's sister. I told him I flew in from the States for the wedding. I said it like the words should unlock a door. Matteo nodded once, not disagreeing but not moving aside. He said the villa had a room roster. He said the owner required the roster to match passports, and the roster could only be changed by the person who signed the rental contract or a wedding planner with written authorization. He said it like a rule he had repeated many times to people who thought family ties counted as paperwork. He turned his phone toward me. Names, room numbers, check-in dates. It was clean and formatted and final. My name wasn't there. For a moment, I assumed it was a clerical error, the kind of thing that happens when you mix languages and time zones and too many moving parts. I asked him to check again. I watched his thumb move down the list. I watched him stop at the letter where my last name should have been, like he wanted it to appear if he stared long enough. He looked up and said he was sorry. The word sorry didn't soften anything. It just confirmed that I was outside a gate in a country where I didn't have a car, didn't have a local number, and didn't have a key. I asked him what people did in this situation because I needed something practical. I needed a next step that wasn't me standing there until dark. Matteo said he could call the contact listed on the reservation. He said he could also give me the phone number for the local agency, but they would tell me the same thing. Without authorization, he couldn't add a guest. Without a room assignment, he couldn't issue a key or a code. If I wasn't on the roster, I wasn't a resident. I was a visitor at the gate. He asked if I had an email confirmation, a screenshot of the room assignment, anything that showed I was supposed to stay there, something he could attach to the file while he waited for the authorized contact to respond. I opened my email and searched my sister's name. I found the itinerary for the week dinner reservations, the boat schedule, a note about dress colors for photos. I found a forwarded message from a planner about transportation. I found plenty of evidence that I existed in the wedding plans. I didn't find a room. I pulled up the family group chat and scrolled back through the last month. There were pictures, jokes, reminders about flights. My mother's messages about keeping the peace. My father asking if anyone had packed a steamer for his suit. Lena's updates about vendors and timing. Nothing that said, "This is your room. This is your key code. This is where you'll sleep." Matteo watched me search, not intruding, not offering comfort. He wasn't unkind. He was doing his job, which meant he couldn't let my problem become his responsibility. He asked one more time if I wanted him to call the reservation contact. I said yes because I needed the call to happen on record, not as a private conversation that could be denied later. He stepped back inside the gate and dialed. I could hear his voice through the crack in the opening, low and formal, introducing himself, explaining that a guest had arrived without being listed on the roster. He waited, listening. His face stayed neutral, but his eyes flicked toward me, once then away. He ended the call and came back out. He told me the contact did not answer. He said he left a message. He said he would try again in a few minutes. Behind him up the hill, I could see movement through a window. People. My family, probably. Or people who looked like family from a distance because they belonged inside, and I didn't. My phone buzzed in my hand. A notification from the group chat. A photo had just been posted. Lena and her fiancé with a couple holding champagne glasses tagged as special guests finally here. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I looked back at Matteo and asked a question I didn't want to ask because asking it made the situation real. If my name wasn't on the roster, where was I supposed to stay? He didn't guess. He didn't suggest a solution. He said he didn't know and that he couldn't assume. He said the roster was the only thing he could follow. He said if I wanted, he could recommend hotels and help me call a taxi. It was still daylight, but the certainty I'd carried across the ocean was already gone. I was standing in the wrong place with the right suitcase, and the only truth I had was a list on a stranger's phone that proved I did not belong inside that gate. I didn't know yet who made that choice. I only knew it had been made before I arrived. And I knew I was going to find out exactly what happened to my room. I stayed by the gate because leaving would have meant choosing a direction with no information. The gravel shoulder offered a strip of shade from the stone wall, and I set my carry-on upright like it could stand in for certainty. Matteo went back and forth between calls and quiet, waiting, his phone in his hand, his posture controlled. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't stalling. He was doing what people do when the rules are not theirs to bend. My battery was already down more than I liked. Airplane mode was off now, maps were loading. Messages were coming in, and every small task was pulling power from a phone I suddenly couldn't afford to lose. I plugged in my portable charger and watched the percentage climb by a single point, then stop as if even the electrons were negotiating. The first answer came from my mother, not my sister. It wasn't a question about where I was or whether I'd made it safely from the airport. It was an instruction delivered with the calm confidence of someone who believed the situation had already been handled. She told me to take a breath. She told me not to make this a scene. She told me that weddings were stressful and that Lena was under enough pressure without extra complications. That was how she framed it. Me having nowhere to sleep was an extra complication, not a problem that needed to be fixed, but a mood that needed to be managed. I asked who was on the rental contract. The response came after a few minutes, and it wasn't direct. It was a string of half answers that circled the point without touching it. The planner had the paperwork. The groom's side had arranged certain things. The villa was very strict. It was easier if everyone just cooperated. Matteo, standing a few feet away, held up his phone and angled it so I could see the contact name on the reservation. It wasn't my sister's. It wasn't either of my parents'. It was the wedding planner's business name followed by a number with an Italian country code. That detail mattered. It meant the person who could fix this was not in front of me. It also meant my family could say they weren't responsible because they weren't technically the authorized contact. But the roster didn't change itself. Someone had requested the change. Someone had approved it. Someone had decided my name didn't belong. My sister's answer came next, finally. A message that arrived with just enough delay to feel coordinated. The language was careful. She acknowledged there had been a change. She said it was not ideal. She said she loved me. She said the villa was full and things got complicated. Then she gave me the reason. The room I had been expected to use had been reassigned to a VIP guest on her fiancé's side, a business partner, a couple they couldn't offend, someone important enough that the planner had insisted the villa had to be adjusted. The message didn't say who volunteered my room. It didn't say who suggested it. It didn't say anyone was sorry in a way that carried weight. It simply stated the new reality as if reality was a weather pattern and not a series of choices. Within minutes, my father followed up. He attached a screenshot of the week's schedule, zoomed in on the ceremony time, the rehearsal dinner, the photographer's pickup. It looked like proof that everything was under control. It didn't include a single line about where I would sleep. My mother sent another message, this one more specific. She listed options as if she'd already priced them out. There was a small hotel in town. There was a budget place near the train station. There were cute little rooms farther out that would require a taxi. She wrote them like suggestions for a weekend getaway, not as an emergency plan being assembled in real time for someone already standing outside a locked gate. She emphasized that I was good at finding deals. She reminded me that I didn't need much, just a bed, just somewhere to shower. It was only a few nights, only, a word that made inconvenience sound like virtue. I looked up the distance from the villa to the nearest town. The map showed winding roads and limited public transit. It wasn't a place where you could walk back after dinner, not safely, not with a dress and a phone battery you were trying to conserve. The risk shifted. In Chicago, a lack of planning meant you were annoyed and late. Here it meant you could be stranded. Mateo came back out and told me he had reached the planner. The planner confirmed the roster was correct. She said she was sorry for the confusion. She said the villa was at capacity and the assignments were finalized. She said if I was not on the overnight list, the property could not accommodate me. Liability insurance, occupancy limits. Mateo didn't add drama to it. He didn't need to. The words did their own work. The decision had been made elsewhere and the rules were doing what rules do when you're the person left out. I asked him again what time the villa staff would be available in the morning because I needed to know if there was any realistic window to resolve this before the day turned into wedding events. He gave me a narrow time range. He told me when the office at the agency opened. He offered to write down addresses for hotels that were legitimate, not the kind that disappear from the internet the moment you pay. While he spoke, I watched cars pass through the gate behind him, guests arriving with small bags, laughing, being waved through without stopping. A man I didn't recognize stepped out of a car in a linen suit and carried himself like he'd been invited into the center of the story. He didn't look at me. Nobody did. I checked the group chat again. More pictures, a table setting, a view of the lake, a caption about family together at last. My name wasn't in any of it. Not as a tag, not as a mention, not as a question. The pattern was suddenly clear in a way I couldn't argue with. The room hadn't been forgotten. It had been used, reassigned with purpose. My discomfort was being treated as the cost of keeping someone else comfortable. I asked my sister one more time in writing who had authorized the change. The answer didn't come. Instead, my mother sent a message about priorities, about being supportive, about not making Lena choose between me and her future in-laws, about how this was 1 week and how we could talk about it when everyone was home and calm. Home and calm, later, always later. I stood by the gate and looked at the villa one more time, trying to locate myself inside it. I pictured the bedrooms, the bathrooms, the mirror I'd planned to use while getting ready. I pictured myself walking in for breakfast, hair still damp, being part of the morning, instead of an outsider coming in from somewhere else. Then I stopped picturing it, because it wasn't true. In that moment, the unfairness wasn't just that I had no room. It was that nobody inside seemed to think it required urgency. The villa had rules, the planner had authority, the family had a story they were telling themselves, and I was standing outside it expected to cooperate. I didn't ask Mateo to keep calling. He had already done what he could, and every extra attempt would have turned my problem into a performance on the other side of that gate. I thanked him, took the list of hotel names he offered to write down, and stepped away from the entrance so the next car could pull in without having to maneuver around me. The sun was still up, but the light had shifted. The heat was softer, the shadows longer. It was the time of day when you start thinking about where you're going to be in 2 hours, not where you hope to be. I walked down the road far enough that the camera at the gate couldn't frame me anymore. Not because I was hiding from it, but because I didn't want to stand in that same spot while my family decided whether I deserved access to a bed. I found a low stone wall and sat with my suitcase beside me, shoulders squared, phone held close to the charger as if the cable could anchor me. The first decision wasn't dramatic. It was simple. I needed a safe, legitimate place to sleep tonight, and I needed a receipt that proved it. Not because I was planning a fight, but because in my family, anything that wasn't written down became flexible later. I opened the hotel websites Mateo had listed and compared addresses against the map. One was cheap, but isolated. One was close to the train, but in an area I couldn't verify. One was more than I wanted to pay, but it had a 24-hour front desk and clear cancellation terms. The reviews weren't poetic. They were practical. Clean sheets, working locks, staff that answered calls. That was what I needed. I booked it with a credit card that I kept for travel emergencies and saved the confirmation email to a folder I rarely used. Then I took screenshots. I saved the hotel address as a pin on the map. I wrote the check-in time in my notes with the number for a taxi company Mateo had mentioned. After that, I made the second decision, the one that felt heavier than the first. I would stop trying to solve my family's feelings in real time. I typed a short message into the group chat. Nothing dramatic, no blame. I stated the only facts that mattered. I wasn't on the villa roster. The planner confirmed the assignments were final. I had booked a hotel. I would be present for the wedding events as scheduled. If anyone needed to reach me about logistics, they could do it there. I sent it, then muted the conversation thread. Not because I didn't care, but because every new message was going to be a pullback toward the same role, the person who absorbs disruption, so everyone else can enjoy the view. My sister's profile icon lit up as typing for a few seconds and then stopped. Nothing came through. My mother sent a thumbs-up reaction, the kind you use when you want the appearance of agreement without the cost of actual responsibility. I stood and started walking suitcase behind me, and it hit me how quiet it was without the soundtrack of my family. No chatter, no instructions, no reminders. Just my footsteps and the sound of insects in the trees. At the main road, I flagged down a taxi and gave the driver the hotel address. He nodded, loaded my suitcase, and started the meter without asking questions. The simplicity of that exchange felt almost foreign. In my world back home, nothing moved unless I pushed it. The drive took longer than I expected, a winding route that made the villa feel even more remote. As we passed small clusters of buildings, I watched for anything that looked like a place I could walk to if I needed food or medicine later. I wasn't being dramatic. I was planning like someone who couldn't assume a rescue. When we reached the hotel, it looked exactly like the pictures online, which felt like a small miracle. The lobby was plain bright and staffed. A woman behind the desk greeted me in English without surprise, asked for my passport, and printed a registration form. She handed me a key card and pointed out the elevator. I took the key card and felt the shift in my body. Not relief exactly, more like a door closing behind me. Upstairs, my room was narrow and clean. A bed, a small desk, a bathroom with a working lock. I set my suitcase on the floor and checked the window. It faced a parking lot and a line of trees. No lake, no villa, no curated romance of a wedding week, just a place where I could sleep with my phone charging beside me. I plugged in my devices and sat at the desk opening my calendar. The wedding schedule was still the wedding schedule. There was a rehearsal dinner that night. There was a morning meetup the next day. There were photos, a ceremony, a reception. The difference was that every time was now paired with a question I hadn't needed to ask before. How would I get there? Who would I ride with? If the dinner ran late, how would I get back? Would taxis be available, or would I be stranded waiting in the dark with a dead phone? I opened the local transit app and saw how limited the options were. I looked up taxi numbers and saved them. I wrote down the address of the villa as the driver would need it, not as my family would say it. I set alarms on my phone that did not depend on anyone else. As I worked, my phone buzzed again and again with muted notifications. I didn't open them. I didn't want to be pulled into explaining why I had done something as basic as book a room. I did, however, open the message Mateo had sent after I left the gate. It was short and formal. He confirmed in writing that my name was not on the overnight roster and that any changes had to come from the authorized contact on the reservation. He included the time and his full name. That was the first thing all day that felt solid. Not comforting. Solid. I replied with a brief thank you. Then I saved it. a small piece of proof that couldn't be rewritten later. By the time I was dressed for the rehearsal dinner, the sky outside my window had gone dark. I stood in front of the mirror in the hotel bathroom and looked at myself longer than I normally would. Not for makeup, for orientation. I had flown across an ocean to stand outside a gate and learn that I was optional. I was still going to show up. I was still going to do what I said I would do. But I was no longer going to stand in one place waiting for my family to decide whether I belonged. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm because the room was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you listen for what you might be missing. The hotel's curtains didn't quite meet in the middle, and a narrow stripe of early light fell across the desk where I had lined up my charger, my passport, and the key card like a checklist. My phone had been charging all night. The battery was full, but my patience wasn't. I made coffee from the single-serve machine by the window and drank it standing up. The wedding schedule on my calendar looked the same as it had the night before, but my day had a new layer under it. Transportation timing, and the fact that I now had to treat a family event like a trip where I didn't have a base. I checked the group chat once not to engage but to see what had changed overnight. There were messages about breakfast at the villa, a reminder about outfits for photos, a joke from my father about Italian espresso. Still nothing about where I was sleeping, nothing asking if I'd made it to my hotel or if I needed a ride. That absence was its own kind of information. I left the chat and opened my email. I searched for the planner's name, then for the villa's address. I pulled up everything I had: the itinerary, the transportation note, the list of local vendors. I created a folder and started moving documents into it one by one, the way you do when you know you'll need to find something quickly later. The first thing that stood out wasn't the missing room. It was my name. My name was everywhere in small places. On forwarded confirmations, on shared spreadsheets, on messages that ended with, "Ask her, she has it." There were threads where my mother had sent a question, and then my sister had written, "She already handled it." There were receipts for dinners that had been charged to my card and settled later with a Venmo transfer that never came. Individually, none of it looked like a crime. It looked like a family. But taken together, it looked like a system with a single point of failure: me. I opened a blank note and started listing what I could remember without digging. It wasn't a rant. It was inventory. Airline accounts I managed because my parents forgot passwords. A shared photo album that my mother insisted on controlling but had never learned how to access. A streaming subscription that had been paid from my card for years because I was the one who set it up in the first place. The family calendar that everyone used but no one maintained except me. Then I moved from memory to proof. I logged into the family travel account, the one we used to coordinate flights and confirmations. The login still worked because I had set it up and kept it updated. The first screen showed saved passengers, saved payment methods, and past trips. My card was still there, not just as a one-time payment, as a default. I opened the payment settings and took a screenshot. I didn't change anything. I wasn't doing that yet. I just documented what was true. I checked the shared cloud drive that my sister had used to collect wedding documents. The folder was full of vendor contracts and PDF attachments and photo inspiration. It had my email listed as a collaborator with full access. I could see who had created the folder, who had invited others, and who had accepted. I took screenshots of that too. I wasn't building a case in a courtroom, not at this stage. I was building clarity for myself. When people got nervous, they rewrote history. They forgot details that made them look bad. They remembered different versions of conversations. Screenshots didn't remember differently. My phone buzzed with an email from the hotel confirming my second night. I filed it and added it to the folder. Then I opened my banking app and checked my credit card balance, not because I was worried about the hotel charge, but because travel always exposed the hidden leaks. There were 2 pending charges I didn't recognize. Small, both under $50 from a vendor name that looked like a service fee. I clicked into the details and saw the location tag near the villa. I stared at it until it turned from confusing into obvious. Someone had used my card number, not physically, not with the chip. It had been stored somewhere, saved in a system used with a click. I didn't call the bank. I didn't freeze the card. Not yet. I needed to know what I was looking at before I reacted. A rash move would turn the next 24 hours into chaos, and chaos was the thing my family could always use as an excuse. I opened the travel account again and dug into the reservations, a local car service deposit, a small add-on fee for guest handling, the kind of line item that gets buried under the bigger numbers. The booking details listed the purchaser email. Mine. I sat back in the chair and let my hands rest on the desk. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, a delivery truck backed up with a beeping sound that felt too sharp for the early hour. This wasn't about forgetting me a room. That was the visible part. The part that happened at a gate, where a stranger could point to a roster and confirm I wasn't included. This was the part that happened quietly in accounts and settings and automatic defaults. The part where my identity and my payment methods stayed attached because it made everything easier for everyone else. I went through the rest of the accounts the way you go through a house after a storm, checking for damage in places you don't usually look. My family phone plan account, where I was listed as an authorized manager because I had fixed a billing error once and never got removed. A retail account my mother used for home deliveries, still tied to my email because she didn't want too many passwords. A shared calendar where I was the only one with admin permissions. Each one was a small piece of the same pattern. I was the infrastructure. Not because anyone had signed a document making me so, but because the default had been set and no one had bothered to change it. By late morning, I had a folder full of confirmations, screenshots, and timestamps. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would impress a jury, but enough that I could no longer tell myself this was just wedding stress or bad planning. It was dependence dressed up as closeness. I closed my laptop and packed my bag for the day's events. My phone buzzed again with muted messages. I didn't open them. I wasn't ready to speak, but I was ready to keep records, because whatever happened next, I wanted one thing that I did not have at the gate: proof. The wedding day arrived the way big days often do, not with a dramatic shift, but with a schedule that didn't care how you slept the night before. I woke up in the same narrow hotel room, checked the time, and watched the first notifications stack up on my phone like unopened mail. I didn't open the group chat. I opened my calendar. Hair appointment, photo location, ceremony start, reception address. Times in between that assumed I would be moving with the family in a car I didn't have from a place I wasn't staying. I took a shower, got dressed, and packed a small tote with what I would need to make it through a long day without relying on anyone else. Phone charger, passport, a bottle of water, a snack, cash and small bills for taxis. I wasn't planning to disappear. I was planning to function. In the lobby, the front desk printed a receipt for my stay without me asking. The paper felt heavier than it should have, proof of where I was while my family posted photos about being together. Outside, the air was bright and clean. I ordered a taxi and watched the driver confirm the address on his phone. The meter started, and with it, the quiet math of the day. Every trip would cost me money. Every delay would cost me more. This wasn't just emotional. It was financial. It was logistical. It was measurable. When I arrived at the villa for photos, no one met me at the entrance. I walked in as a daytime guest. The gate opened because Matteo recognized me now, not because I belonged there overnight. People were already moving around the courtyard. A stylist carrying a garment bag, someone arranging chairs, the photographer directing light, my sister in a robe with her hair pinned up, surrounded by people who had slept under the same roof as her. She looked at me the way you look at someone you're glad showed up because it relieves your guilt, not because you solved their problem. She hugged me quickly, asked if I was okay, and then her attention was pulled back into the current. I nodded. I said yes. I smiled the way I had learned to smile when saying more would make me the problem. The day ran on rails. Photos, family members rotating in and out like props. The ceremony by the water. The reception under lights strung across a terrace. I did what was required of me and nothing extra. I didn't fix anything. I didn't volunteer for errands. I didn't become the person who smooths rough edges so everyone else can pretend the edges weren't there. By the time the reception reached that late-hour softness when people loosen their posture and start talking, like they mean what they say, I had already made my decision. I just hadn't done the thing that made it real. I stepped away from the table and walked to the edge of the terrace where the music was quieter. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I had made the day before. Screenshots, confirmations, notes with dates and times, the planner's business name on the reservation, Mateo's written message confirming I was not on the overnight roster, and the 2 small pending charges on my card tagged near the villa tied to reservations that listed my email as the purchaser. I stared at those charges until I stopped thinking of them as an accident. If my payment method was still stored and being used, then the room situation wasn't the only boundary my family felt entitled to cross. That was the moment the situation shifted from insulting to unsafe. Not physically unsafe, but structurally unsafe. If I let this stay loose, it would stay loose forever. My accounts would remain open doors. My name would remain a tool. I didn't confront anyone. Not there. Not in Italy. Not while wedding guests were watching and my sister's dress was still clean. I opened the travel account on my phone and went straight to payment settings. My card was listed as default. I removed it. The app asked for verification, a code sent to my email. I pulled up the email, entered the code, and confirmed. A message appeared saying the payment method had been deleted. I took a screenshot of that confirmation. Then I opened the shared wedding drive and looked at the access list. My email had full permissions. I changed it to view only. Not because I was punishing anyone, because I was cutting off the ability for my identity to be used as an operational shortcut. If they needed someone to upload contracts or edit vendor details, they could do it under their own names. I took another screenshot. Date and time. Change confirmed. I moved to the family phone plan account next. I had access because I was listed as an authorized manager. I found the permission settings and removed myself. The portal warned that I might lose the ability to resolve future billing issues. I accepted. One more confirmation screen, one more screenshot. I went through the list I had made in Chapter 4, but carefully choosing only what was clearly mine to control. A retail account tied to my email. I changed the email to my mother's and sent the verification link. If she didn't click it, the change wouldn't complete. That was her responsibility now, a subscription that had been paid by my card for years. I canceled it and set it to end at the next billing cycle. The service would not vanish overnight. It would simply stop renewing. A clear, predictable outcome. A shared calendar where I was the admin. I transferred ownership to my sister's email and removed my admin role. The platform confirmed the transfer. Each step was small, but the shape they made together was not small at all. A door shutting, then another, then another. When I put my phone down, my hands were steady. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't angry in a way that would burn itself out. I felt something colder and more useful. The next morning, the changes would begin to ripple. Someone would open an app and find a card missing. Someone would try to edit a file and be blocked. Someone would look for a password reset link and see my name no longer worked as a backdoor. They would call it overreacting. They would call it selfish. They would call it cruel. But it wasn't any of those things. It was me making the rules match reality. I returned to the reception, sat down, and let the music wash over the table like nothing had happened. I raised my glass when the toasts came. I smiled for photos. I was still there. I just wasn't available anymore. 4 weeks after I flew home, my life had returned to the kind of normal that looks ordinary from the outside and feels fragile from the inside. I was back at my desk in Chicago, back to grocery runs and laundry and the quiet rhythm of workdays that didn't involve airports or wedding schedules. I hadn't told anyone at work what happened in Italy. I didn't need it to be a story. I needed it to be a closed file. The folder on my laptop wasn't closed, though. It sat in a corner of my desktop named with the villa's address and the month filled with screenshots and confirmations and the time-stamp message from Matteo. I didn't open it every day. I didn't have to. Knowing it was there was enough. The first crack didn't come from my family. It came from a number I didn't recognize calling my phone on a Tuesday afternoon. The voicemail was from a local car service in Italy. The woman spoke careful English and said she was following up on an outstanding balance connected to a wedding week reservation. She referenced a booking number, the villa's name, and an email address on file. Mine. She didn't sound angry. She sounded trained, like someone reading a script that worked on most people. I didn't call her back right away. I pulled up the travel account I had documented in Italy and logged in. My card was gone just as I had left it. The settings showed the deletion confirmation date. That part held. But the reservation history still listed my email as the purchaser on 2 items I hadn't booked myself: a deposit for transportation and a smaller coordination fee that I now recognized as one of the pending charges I had seen near the villa. I opened my email and searched the booking number the voicemail had mentioned. There it was, buried in a thread forwarded to the family list. The subject line included my sister's name and the dates of the wedding week. The confirmation had been sent to the planner, copied to my mother, and forwarded through the travel account that still carried my email as the default contact. No one had asked before attaching my name. No one had checked whether my card was still available. They had simply used the path that had always worked. Except now, it didn't. I sat back and let the consequence take shape in my head in a way that was practical, not emotional. When a vendor couldn't charge the card on file, they went to the contact. When the contact didn't respond, they called again. When that failed, they escalated to collections or canceled services for future dates. My name was the contact, so the problem came to me. I opened a fresh note and wrote the date, the number that called the booking number, and the exact language from the voicemail. Then I typed one sentence at the bottom: "This is not my debt." I called the car service back during my lunch break. I asked for an email address and requested all documentation associated with the booking, including the authorization and the person who signed for the service. I asked them to send it to me in writing. The woman agreed. She sounded relieved, like she wanted the file off her desk. Within an hour, the email arrived. The invoice listed the planner's company as the contracting party. The pickup details matched the villa. The passenger names included my parents and the groom's VIP guests. And the billing contact line was my email. There was no signature from me, no authorization form with my name, no proof I had agreed to be responsible. Just a contact field filled in because it had been convenient. That detail mattered. It meant I wasn't guessing. I wasn't assuming. I had a document. I forwarded the email to my mother and my sister with a short note stating the facts, not accusations. Facts. The vendor had contacted me for payment. The contract was in the planner's name. My email was listed as billing contact. If they wanted to correct it, the planner needed to update the vendor records immediately. I didn't ask if they felt bad. I didn't ask for an apology. I asked for a correction. My phone buzzed almost immediately. A string of messages appeared muted, stacked on top of each other like a pile of dishes nobody wanted to wash. My mother's tone moved quickly from confusion to irritation to the familiar line about timing. Why now? Why bring this up? Why make things harder when everyone was finally back home? My sister wrote that she would handle it. She wrote that she was overwhelmed. She wrote that she wished I could just be patient. Patient again. As if my name being used as a billing contact was a personality flaw I should manage privately. I didn't respond in the chat. I replied only by email, forwarding the invoice again and repeating the same request: update the billing contact and confirm in writing when it was done. That was the second crack. The third came 2 days later when my credit card app sent a push alert about a declined charge. Not a fraudulent transaction in progress. A renewal. It was the streaming subscription I had canceled in Italy, the one that had been paid with my card for years. The end-of-cycle cancellation date had arrived. The subscription tried to renew and couldn't. A normal family would shrug and re-enter a payment method. My family treated it like an emergency. My mother called during work hours, then again. Then she sent a message asking what I had done. My father followed with a short text asking for the password like always. I stared at the screen and felt the shape of the new reality. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just different. The small conveniences I had been providing had become visible only when they disappeared. That evening, I checked my email again and saw another message from a vendor. This time, it was a late fee notice tied to a dinner reservation deposit for wedding week that had been charged back after my card was removed. The email was polite, but the language was firmer. Pay by a certain date or the account would be referred to a third party for collections. Again, it was addressed to me. I opened the attachment and read it twice. The deposit amount was small, but the principle wasn't. My name was being used as a place to send consequences, a bucket for other people's messes. I replied to the vendor, attaching the invoice from the car service as an example of what I needed from them: the contracting party, the authorization, the signature. I stated clearly that I was not the authorized purchaser and that any billing contact associated with my email had been added without my consent. I asked them to update their records and to direct all future correspondence to the planner listed on the contract. I kept my tone neutral, professional, and boring, the kind of email that doesn't create drama, the kind of email that becomes evidence if someone ever needs it to. Then I forwarded that exchange to my lawyer friend from college, the one person I trusted, to tell me if I was missing something obvious. I didn't ask for a plan. I asked a simple question. If they keep using my name like this, what should I do next? I didn't have an answer yet, not a full one. But I could see the outline of the next month forming like weather on the horizon. Vendors, records, contacts, written corrections that needed to happen whether my family wanted to acknowledge them or not. The collapse had started not as a dramatic explosion, but as a series of emails and invoices that arrived in my inbox because my name was still attached to a system they didn't want to learn how to run. And I was done absorbing it in silence. The week after the vendor emails started coming in, my family stopped acting confused and started acting offended. It was subtle at first, the way offense often is, a change in tone, a shift from "we didn't realize" to "how could you?" I could have ignored it if it had stayed inside the group chat, but it didn't. On Thursday morning, I got an email forwarded from my sister with a subject line that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with control. Urgent, please respond. It was from the wedding planner. The planner wrote that she had received complaints from multiple parties about disruptions after the wedding. She said vendors were contacting the wrong people. She said payments had unexpectedly failed. She said certain services were now threatening fees and collections notices. She asked for a conference call so they could get aligned and move forward. The email was polite, but it was not neutral. It framed the problem as something that had happened to them, not something that had been built on top of me for years. At the bottom, my mother had replied before my sister forwarded it. Her reply was short and decisive. She said the reason vendors were confused was because I had changed things without telling anyone and removed my payment information at a sensitive time. She copied the planner and my sister. She did not copy me. My sister forwarded the thread to me afterward like an afterthought, as if I was supposed to read the accusation, accept it, and then show up to a call to fix it. That was the first time the narrative became formal, not just family frustration. Written blame in a business thread. My hands went cold on my mouse, not because I was shocked they were angry, because I understood the risk. Once something like that sits in writing with third parties, it becomes the version of events people repeat. It becomes the default story, and default stories are hard to undo. I opened the email chain and read it again slower. There were no facts, no dates, no mention of the authorized contact on the villa reservation. No acknowledgement that vendors had listed my email as billing contact without my consent. Just the implication that I had caused disruption by withdrawing support. In other words, the same pattern dressed up in professional language. I didn't reply in anger. I didn't reply at all. Not yet. I opened my folder and pulled the documents that mattered. Mateo's message confirming I was not on the overnight roster and that only the authorized contact could change it. The invoice from the car service showing the planner as contracting party and my email as billing contact. The cancellation confirmation for the subscription. The screenshots of the travel account payment settings showing my card deletion date. Then I wrote a response, but I didn't send it immediately. I drafted it the way you draft something when you know it might be read later, by people who don't care about feelings, only about who was authorized to do what. I stated that vendors were contacting my email because it had been listed as billing contact on multiple reservations. I stated that I had not authorized the use of my email for billing correspondence and had not signed any agreements with vendors. I stated that any updates to vendor records needed to come from the contracting party or authorized planner contact. I attached the invoice and Mateo's written confirmation as examples of the documentation I was receiving. I asked in writing for the planner to provide a complete list of all reservations and vendors where my email had been used as a billing contact, along with the authorization basis for that. I asked for a deadline to correct the vendor records and confirm in writing when it was completed. I kept it clinical. I didn't use the word family. I didn't use the word betrayal. I didn't accuse anyone of malice. I described a mismatch in records and a need to correct it. Then I hit send. Within minutes, my sister called. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail wasn't an apology. It was pressure. She said the planner was upset. She said Mom was embarrassed. She said vendors were getting the wrong impression. She said I was making Lena's marriage start with drama. I listened once, then saved it. Date time content. Not because I wanted to weaponize it, because the tone was part of the pattern. When they couldn't pull me back with family language, they tried to pull me back with reputation language. Later that afternoon, another email arrived. This time from a vendor I recognized the caterer's office manager. The message said they had received a call from someone claiming to be me, requesting a change to the billing contact, and asking for a copy of the invoice to be resent to a different address. The office manager wrote that they could not comply without verifying identity and asked me to confirm whether I had made the request. I stared at the screen and felt my stomach tighten, not from fear but from clarity. This wasn't just blame anymore. It was someone trying to use my name. The email included a timestamp and the phone number that had called them. The number was an American number, not Italian. It wasn't mine. I didn't reply with suspicion. I replied with a fact. I told the office manager I had not made that call. I asked them to note in their file that no changes should be accepted from anyone claiming to be me unless the request came in, writing from my email, and included verification steps they required. I asked them to keep a record of the call details and to provide any written notes they had. Then I forwarded that email to the planner and copied my mother and sister, making sure everyone saw it in the same thread. I wrote one sentence explaining why it mattered someone had attempted to change vendor records using my identity. I didn't say who. I didn't need to. The act spoke for itself. My mother replied within 10 minutes. She said it was probably a misunderstanding. She said people were scrambling. She said I was reading into things. She said if I would just join the conference call, we could put this behind us. It was the same request in a different suit. Fix it, make it smooth, absorb the chaos so we can move on. But now there was an external record of someone trying to impersonate me. A vendor had refused, asked for confirmation, and created an email trail with a timestamp and a phone number. That was the kind of detail that doesn't stay inside a family argument. It becomes something else. It becomes risk. I called the vendor office manager not to argue, but to make sure they understood I appreciated that they stopped the change. I asked them to keep the phone number that had called and to save any internal notes. I asked if their system recorded caller ID logs or if they had a policy for documenting attempted identity claims. The manager explained what they could and couldn't retain and offered to send a brief written summary. I accepted. That evening after work, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and the folder of documents beside it. It wasn't a dramatic scene, just paperwork in a quiet apartment. I wrote down what I now knew as facts. My email had been used as billing contact on reservations I didn't contract for. Vendors were contacting me for money and late fees. My mother had put blame in writing to the planner, claiming I changed things without telling anyone. A vendor had documented an attempted identity request tied to a phone number that wasn't mine. The situation had moved beyond hurt feelings. It had moved into the territory where I could be dragged into disputes and collections activity because my name had been used as a tool. My plan from Italy had been simple: remove access document changes and let the system adjust. Now I had to adjust too, because my family wasn't just trying to pull me back. They were trying to make me responsible again in writing and with other people watching. The following Monday, I took a half day off work and went to a small office on the 7th floor of an older building in the Loop. The lobby smelled faintly of copier toner and burnt coffee, the kind of place where people came to solve problems that didn't fit into a phone call. The sign on the glass door had a law firm name in black letters and a list of practice areas that sounded like the adult version of being grounded: contracts, consumer disputes, identity misuse. I had found the firm through a referral, not an ad. That mattered to me. I didn't need a crusader. I needed someone who would stay inside the lines and still get results. The receptionist took my name and handed me a clipboard. While I filled out basic information, my phone buzzed with another muted message from my sister. I didn't open it. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to make my next steps real. The attorney who met with me was a woman in her 40s with gray streaks at her temples and the calm, efficient tone of someone who had listened to too many people apologize for taking up space. She asked me to start at the beginning and then stop when I reached the part where written records began. So I did. I told her about arriving at the Villa Gate in Italy and finding my name off the overnight roster. I told her about Matteo's written confirmation. I told her about the invoices that followed me home, the vendor calls, the late fee notices. I told her about the planner thread where my mother blamed me in writing. I told her about the catering office manager who documented an attempted identity request tied to a phone number that wasn't mine. I didn't describe feelings. I described events. When I finished, she asked the question that changed the shape of the problem. What outcome do you want? It wasn't a philosophical question. It was a practical one. I said I wanted my name removed from anything I did not contract for. I said I wanted vendors instructed in writing to stop contacting me. I said I wanted a clear paper trail showing I did not authorize changes or billing responsibility. And I said I wanted my family to stop using my identity as a lever to make me responsible again. The attorney nodded once, then asked what I had already done. I showed her my folder, screenshots with dates and times, the car service invoice listing the planner as contracting party, the vendor email documenting the impersonation attempt, the travel account payment deletion confirmation, the message from Matteo confirming the roster rule and the authorized contact requirement. She flipped through it without comment, which I appreciated. Then she started sorting my situation into categories that had names: vendor disputes, record corrections, possible identity misuse, misrepresentation to third parties. She didn't say call the police. She didn't say sue your family. She said something more useful. We start with written notice and record correction. We build an audit trail. If they keep escalating, we escalate through the appropriate channels. She explained what she could do without guessing. A formal letter to the planner and any vendors who had contacted me stating that I was not the contracting party and that my email had been used as billing contact without my consent. A request for each vendor's documentation, who signed, who authorized, and where the billing contact information came from. A demand that vendor records be updated to the contracting party's email and phone number. She also explained what she could not do. She couldn't force an Italian vendor to behave the way an American one would. She couldn't guarantee a response timeline. But she could make sure my position was documented and that I did not accept responsibility by silence. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and wrote a short list of what she needed from me by the end of the week. Every vendor email, every invoice, the planner's full contact information, the phone number attached to the impersonation attempt, the name of the rental agency or property owner if I had it, any proof of who signed the villa contract, any screenshots showing my email listed as billing contact. Then she gave me a separate list of what I should not do. Do not join a conference call with the planner. Do not argue in group chats. Do not agree to handle it for the sake of peace. Do not pay anything even temporarily unless we have written confirmation it's legally your obligation. That last part hit harder than I expected. Not because I was tempted to pay, but because I knew how easily I used to do it. Just this once was how half my family problems had begun. Before I left, she drafted a short notice for me to send immediately to the planner and copy my mother and sister on. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary in professional language. It stated that any use of my name, email, or billing contact information without my written consent was unauthorized. It stated that I was withdrawing any implied permission to act on my behalf. It requested within 10 business days a complete list of all vendors and reservations where my contact information had been used and written confirmation that each record had been corrected. 10 business days. A time frame that existed in reality, not in family arguments. I sent the email from my phone in the elevator not because I wanted drama, but because I wanted the timestamp. When I reached street level, the city noise felt different. Not louder, just clearer. I had done something that couldn't be hand-waved away as a mood. Back at my apartment, I set up a separate email folder labeled with the wedding week and the word disputes. I created a spreadsheet with columns for vendor name, invoice number, amount, date, contacted, contracting, party, listed, billing, contact, listed, and action taken. It wasn't glamorous. It was control. That afternoon, the first response came in from the catering office manager. She sent a brief summary of the impersonation attempt, including the time of call, the caller ID number, and a note that their staff had refused to make changes without written verification. I saved it. I forwarded it to my attorney. I forwarded it to the planner, copying my mother and sister. I didn't write commentary. The document spoke for itself. My sister finally sent an email instead of a chat message. She asked why I was involving lawyers. She wrote that it made her feel like I was attacking her. She wrote that I was taking something that was already over and dragging it into something ugly. I read it twice and then left it unanswered for the moment, not because I didn't have a response, because the response I wanted would have been emotional, and emotion was the language my family used to slide past facts. The facts were already moving now through formal channels on a calendar that did not belong to them. I wasn't winning, not yet, but I wasn't standing outside a gate anymore either, hoping someone would decide to let me in. 10 business days is a long time when you're used to family problems being handled by whoever caves first. In a normal argument, silence gets filled with calls and guilt and pressure until someone gives in. In a formal process, silence is just a calendar. By the end of the first week, my spreadsheet had grown from 3 vendors to 7. Some were in Italy, some were US-based companies who had provided services for the wedding week through international partners. Every row had the same pattern: a service tied to the villa, an invoice tied to the planner's company, and my email sitting in the billing contact field like a spare key left under a mat. The difference now was that each vendor was responding in writing. Not all of them wanted to, but written notice tends to do what emotional pleas can't. It forces people to choose between fixing their records or explaining on paper why they won't. The first real finding came from the rental agency that managed the villa. They were not apologetic. They were careful. Their email arrived on a Wednesday morning with a PDF attachment labeled Reservation Summary. The message explained in plain terms what Matteo had already told me at the gate overnight. Guests were limited by contract changes, required authorization, and the roster had been finalized before the wedding week began. Then they answered the question I had asked in Chapter 2 and never gotten answered by my family. Who requested the change? The PDF showed a change log. Date, time, the name of the account that initiated it. It wasn't my name. It wasn't my sister's. It was the wedding planner's account, and the note attached to the change read room reassigned to accommodate VIP guest, family member to stay off-site. Family member, not a name, a role. The agency didn't editorialize. They didn't have to. The language was clean, corporate, and brutal in its simplicity. Someone had made a decision and documented it like an ordinary adjustment. I forwarded the email and the PDF to my attorney and saved them in my folder. Then I forwarded them to my mother and sister, copying the planner. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. A few hours later, the planner responded. She did not deny the change log. She did not claim it was a mistake. She wrote that the groom's family had requested accommodations for a VIP guest, that the villa had limited capacity, and that she had been forced to make trade-offs. She wrote that she assumed my family had communicated the change to me and that she regretted any miscommunication. It was a carefully written paragraph designed to spread responsibility across everyone and land it nowhere specific. But the log had already done its job. It had turned a fuzzy family story into a documented choice. The second finding arrived from the catering office manager. She confirmed again that someone had called claiming to be me. She provided the caller ID number in writing and attached an internal note showing that their staff had refused the request due to lack of verification. Then she added one more detail. The caller had also asked for the invoice to be resent to an address for my mother using my mother's full name. That wasn't a legal conclusion. It was a fact in a vendor's note. It narrowed the circle in a way my family could not talk their way out of. My mother called me that night. I let it go to voicemail again. The voicemail was different this time. The tone had changed from offended to cautious. She said the planner had sent her some paperwork and that things were being misinterpreted. She said the vendor office people were overreacting. She said this was becoming serious and asked me to call her back so we could handle it privately. Privately was the word people used when they wanted something to stop leaving fingerprints. I didn't call her. I replied by email, copying my attorney, and asked a simple question with a simple deadline. If my mother's name was being used in vendor requests, who made the call, and why was it tied to my identity? The third set of findings came from the vendors who had been trying to collect payment. One Italian vendor confirmed that my email had been used as billing contact because it was pulled from the planner's master spreadsheet of wedding contacts. The vendor attached a screenshot of the spreadsheet row they had received. It listed my email beside the word billing with no signature or authorization. A U.S.-based payment processor confirmed that 2 charges had been attempted against my card because it had been stored in the travel account as default at the time reservations were created. They explained that once the card was removed, future charges failed and triggered automated notices to the billing contact on file. Then they did the thing that mattered most. They updated the record. They removed my email as billing contact. They replaced it with the planner's business address. They confirmed in writing that I was not responsible for the balance and that their notices should not be interpreted as a claim against me. It wasn't dramatic. It was a line in an email. But it shifted weight, because for the first time, someone outside my family's orbit was saying on paper that I did not owe what they were trying to dump on me. The consequence for my family came quickly after that, not as punishment, but as math. Once my email was removed, the vendors stopped contacting me and started contacting the people listed as contracting party. The planner. My parents, if their names appeared on passenger lists. My sister, if her signature was attached to a dinner deposit. The problem moved back to its rightful address. My mother responded to that shift by trying one last version of the story. She wrote an email to the planner suggesting that to keep things simple, the vendors should continue using my contact information because I was more responsive and better organized. The planner replied copying everyone that she could not do that. She cited the written notice and the vendor logs. She said she needed to comply with correct contracting records. She said in plain language that continuing to route billing notices to me would expose her company to liability for misrepresentation. Liability. A word my family didn't like because it didn't care about feelings. My mother didn't respond after that. My sister did. She sent a long email that started with irritation and ended with exhaustion. She wrote that she had never realized how many things were routed through me. She wrote that she was embarrassed. She wrote that she wished I had just told her before making it legal. What she didn't write was the one thing that mattered: a denial of the documented change log or an explanation for why my room had been traded away in the first place. She couldn't because the paper was now louder than any story they wanted to tell. The week ended with a final message from the rental agency. They confirmed that the reservation file now included a note: no changes to guest rosters or billing contacts would be accepted from anyone claiming to represent me without written verification from my email and ID confirmation. It wasn't a court order. It wasn't a verdict. but it was an external boundary that did not rely on my family's good intentions, and it came with consequences they couldn't dodge. Because the next time someone tried to use my name as a shortcut, the system would refuse them. I sat at my kitchen table and updated my spreadsheet one last time that night, marking rows as corrected disputes as closed and contacts as transferred. The facts were no longer moving in circles. They were landing. And my family, for the first time in my life, was being forced to deal with the mess at the source instead of dropping it in my lap and calling it love. By early December, the wedding week had stopped showing up in my inbox like a second job. My spreadsheet was mostly green now. Corrected, closed, transferred. The few remaining threads were quiet, waiting on final confirmations that moved at the pace of offices, not families. My attorney sent one last summary email that morning. It listed what had been resolved in plain language. My email was removed as billing contact across all identified vendors. The rental agency had added a verification note to the file that blocked anyone from requesting changes in my name without written confirmation and ID verification. The vendors who had issued late fee notices had reissued them to the contracting party. The car service balance was no longer routed to me. The attempted impersonation record remained documented with the vendor's office manager, including caller ID and timestamp, and the vendor confirmed they would not accept requests from anyone claiming to be me without written verification. It wasn't a victory lap. It was an administrative ending. That was what I wanted. Clean, documented, uninteresting. The rest of my life had to match that level of clarity, or I would be pulled back into the same role the next time someone needed a shortcut. So I made changes that looked small from the outside and were permanent on the inside. I changed my phone number and kept the old one active for 30 days with a voicemail message that directed people to one email address if they needed to reach me for something specific. Not for conversation, not for updates, for specific written requests. I opened a post office box in my neighborhood and used that address for anything that needed an address on file, so my home was not a place family problems could arrive uninvited. I reviewed my accounts the way I now knew to review them not when something went wrong, but before it could. I removed my card from any service that wasn't mine. I checked authorized users. I checked recovery emails. I changed passwords that had been shared out of convenience. Each change came with a confirmation email, and I saved those too. I didn't do it in a burst of energy. I did it slowly over 2 weekends the way people build a fence. One post at a time, level, measure it, built to last. My sister emailed twice during that month. The first email was defensive. She said she never told anyone to use my identity. She said the planner just had my email because I was organized. She said she understood why I was upset, but she didn't understand why I had made it so public with vendors and lawyers. I read it and didn't reply, because the answer was in the documents, the villa agency log, the vendor notes, the billing contact fields, the way my mother had tried to keep routing problems to me, even after she knew it was improper. The second email came 2 weeks later and sounded different, shorter, less performative. She said she had finally read the reservation summary from the agency and understood that my room hadn't been forgotten. It had been reassigned deliberately in writing before I arrived. She said she was sorry that she had let herself believe it was just complicated. She said she didn't know what to do with the fact that the first thing she had done after her wedding was try to get me to clean up the mess. That email deserved an answer, but not the kind of answer my family was used to. I replied with a few sentences and a rule. I told her I was not willing to be the billing contact, the default organizer, or the person who handled emergencies for the family. I told her I would not participate in calls where I was expected to fix things in real time. If she wanted a relationship with me, it had to be one where each person carried their own responsibilities. If she needed to reach me, she could email. If it was urgent, she could say so in the subject line and explain why. And if it was something she could solve herself, she would. A week later, my mother tried to test the boundary. Not with an apology, with a request. She emailed asking if I could just call a vendor who was still confused because the vendor always listened to me. She wrote it like a compliment. like competence was the same as consent. I forwarded her email to my attorney and asked for a one-line response I could use without turning it into a fight. The attorney sent back a sentence that sounded dull, which was perfect. I replied to my mother in writing stating that I was not authorized to act on her behalf, that vendors had been instructed to route all correspondence to the contracting party, and that she needed to work directly with the planner or vendor using her own contact information. No anger, no lecture, no debate, just a door that didn't open. After that, the request slowed. Not because my family had suddenly become self-sufficient, but because the old route no longer worked. My name didn't unlock anything. My email didn't act as a back channel. The systems had been corrected, and I had corrected myself. On Christmas Eve, I went to a small dinner at a friend's house in Oak Park. Her parents were there, both in their 70s, moving carefully around the kitchen with the ease of people who had lived long enough to know what matters. Her mother asked if I was going home for the holidays. I said no. I said it simply like it was a schedule choice, not a confession. We ate roast chicken and talked about ordinary things. The conversation drifted to travel to family, to how hard it can be to stop playing the role people assign you. No one asked for details. No one tried to fix me. The night ended with leftovers packed into foil and handed to me at the door. When I got back to my apartment, my phone showed a missed email from my sister. The subject line said, "Just checking in." Inside, she wrote that she hoped I was okay. She wrote that she understood I needed distance. She wrote that she had started handling her own accounts and realized how much work I had been doing for years. She didn't ask me to come home. She didn't ask me to fix anything. I replied the next morning. I thanked her. I told her I was fine. I told her I was keeping my boundaries and I was willing to talk slowly if we could keep it honest. That was as close to healing as I could offer. Not a reunion, not forgiveness on demand, but a relationship with terms that protected me. The last email in my wedding folder arrived in mid-January, almost a year after the trip. A vendor confirmed in writing that their file was updated and closed, and that no further notices would be sent to my email. I archived the thread and closed the folder. Then I went for a walk along the lakefront before work, the wind cold enough to wake me fully. I watched the water move in steady, indifferent waves and thought about how much of my life used to be spent managing other people's storms. I couldn't change what happened at that gate in Italy. I couldn't turn it into something dignified after the fact. What I could do was refuse to let that moment become a template for the rest of my life. If you've ever been the person your family uses as a shortcut, the person they call capable, so they don't have to call you equal, what did it take for you to stop? And what did you have to build in its place?